God asked Abraham to cut animals in half, not sacrifice them, cut them in half. A 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, a young pigeon. He told Abraham to split them down the middle and arrange the pieces in 2 rows facing each other, a pathway of blood and flesh. Then darkness fell, and something moved between those pieces, something Abraham was not supposed to see. This is not the Abraham you learned about in Sunday school. This is not the father of faith standing confident under starlight. This is a 75-year-old man kneeling in animal blood, waiting for God to show up in a way that would shatter every assumption he had about how covenants work. What happened that night in Genesis 15 is one of the most terrifying and misunderstood moments in the entire Bible, because when God makes a promise, the cost is never what you think, and the method he chose that night was borrowed from the darkest covenant rituals of the ancient world. Abraham is old, not elderly, not weathered. Old in the way that makes your bones ache when you remember what you used to believe about your life. He is 75 when God first calls him, 75 when he leaves Ur of the Chaldeans, 75 when he walks away from everything he knows because a voice told him to go to a land he had never seen. By the time we reach Genesis 15, he has been walking for years, still childless, still waiting, still believing a promise that has not materialized. His wife Sarah is barren. The word sits between them like a third person at every meal. Barren. The Hebrew word is akar. It does not just mean unable to conceive. It means uprooted, torn out, a tree that will bear no fruit. And in the ancient Near East, a barren woman was not just unfortunate. She was cursed. She was a social failure. She was the end of a family line. Every month that passed without a child was another month of shame, another month of whispers, another month of wondering if God had forgotten. But Abraham believed. Genesis 15 verse 6 says it plainly. Abraham believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. But belief does not erase the ache. It does not make the waiting easier. It does not give you a child when your body says the time has passed. So God comes to him again, not with another promise, with instructions. Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And Abraham knows exactly what this means, because Abraham grew up in Ur, a city in ancient Mesopotamia, a place where covenants were not signed, they were cut. The Akkadian tablets from that region, some of which archaeologists have recovered, describe covenant ceremonies almost identical to what God is about to do with Abraham. They called it Riksu Nakasu. Cutting a bond, you would kill an animal, split it in half, lay the pieces in 2 rows, and both parties would walk between them. The message was clear. If I break this covenant, may what happened to these animals happen to me. It was a blood oath, a curse ritual, a binding so severe that no one dared break it. And the most chilling part, sometimes, they did not just use animals. Here is where the story gets darker. In 1955, archaeologists working in northern Syria uncovered a collection of tablets from the ancient city of Mari. These tablets date back to the 18th century BC, right around Abraham's time. One of the tablets describes a covenant ceremony between 2 kings. They did not just kill animals. They killed a donkey foal. They split it in half, And then both kings walked between the pieces while reciting a curse. If I violate this treaty, may I be cut in two like this donkey. But that was not the most disturbing part. Another tablet describes a ceremony where the covenant makers would say, "May my sons be cut off, may my descendants be torn apart, may my line end in blood." They were not just cursing themselves, they were cursing their children, their future, their bloodline. This is the world Abraham lived in. This is the covenant language he understood. So when God tells him to prepare the animals, Abraham knows this is not a metaphor. This is not symbolic. This is the most binding, most terrifying, most irreversible oath a person could make. And he also knows that in a few hours, both he and God will walk between those pieces. Both will take the curse. Both will bind themselves to a promise that cannot be broken without death. Except that is not what happens. The sun is going down. Abraham has been working all day, cutting, arranging, keeping the birds of prey away from the carcasses. Genesis 15 verse 11 says, "And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away." This is not a passive waiting. This is violent. This is exhausting. Vultures do not just circle. They descend, they tear, they consume. And Abraham is fighting them off, hour after hour in the desert heat, protecting a covenant he does not fully understand yet. Why does the Bible mention the birds? Because in ancient covenant rituals, if scavengers got to the pieces before the ceremony was complete, the covenant was considered void, contaminated, cursed. Abraham cannot let that happen, so he fights, and then the sun sets. Genesis 15 verse 12, "As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram." The Hebrew word is tardima. It is not rest, it is not exhaustion. It is supernatural unconsciousness. This is the same word used in Genesis 2 verse 21, when God put Adam into a deep sleep to create Eve. Adam did not choose to sleep. God took his consciousness. God performed surgery. God did something Adam could not be awake for. And now, God is doing it again. But this time, there is something else. And behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. The Hebrew phrase is Ima Chashika Gedola. Ima means terror, dread, horror. Chashika Gedola means thick darkness, darkness you can feel. This is not nighttime. This is not the absence of light. This is oppressive, suffocating, supernatural darkness. It is the same word used in Exodus 10 verse 22 to describe the 9th plague, a darkness to be felt. So Abraham is on the ground, unconscious, and the air around him is thick with terror and blackness. And then God speaks. He tells Abraham what is coming. 400 years of slavery for his descendants, affliction in a foreign land, oppression under taskmasters, suffering Abraham will not live to see, but also deliverance, also exodus, also return. God is showing Abraham the future, and it is not gentle. Why does God show him this? Because covenant is not just about blessing. It is about knowing the cost. Abraham needs to understand that the promise God is about to make will require blood, not just animal blood, human blood, the blood of his descendants, the blood of Egypt's firstborns, the blood of a Passover lamb, and eventually the blood of God himself. But Abraham cannot process this yet, so God keeps him unconscious, and then, when the sun has fully set and darkness is complete, Something moves. Genesis 15, verse 17. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. Not Abraham. Abraham is still unconscious. He is not walking through the blood. He is not taking the curse. He is not binding himself to anything. Only God walks through the smoking fire pot, the flaming torch. In Hebrew, Tanner Ashen, a smoking oven, lapid ash, a torch of fire. These are not random objects. They are symbols of God's presence, the same fire that will later appear as a pillar leading Israel through the wilderness, the same fire that will rest on Mount Sinai when God gives the law, the same fire that will fill the tabernacle when the glory of the Lord descends. God is manifesting himself in physical form and walking between the pieces alone. And here is what makes your spine cold. In every other ancient covenant ceremony, both parties walked through the blood. Both parties said, "If I break this, may I be torn apart like these animals." But God does not let Abraham walk through. God puts him to sleep. God walks alone. God takes the full weight of the curse upon himself. This is not a negotiation. This is not a partnership. This is not a contract where both sides have equal responsibility. This is God saying, "I will keep this promise even if you fail. I will carry this covenant even if you break it. I will be torn apart before I let this fail." Theologians call this a unilateral covenant, a one-sided oath. But here is the question that should haunt us. Why did God choose this method? Why use a blood ritual from pagan cultures? Why borrow a ceremony that involved curses and death? Because God was speaking a language Abraham would understand. In that moment, God was not inventing something new. He was taking the darkest, most binding oath of the ancient world and turning it into grace. Every covenant Abraham had ever seen required both parties to walk through, both parties to take the curse, both parties to risk death. But God said, "Not this time. This time I walk alone," and in doing so, God revealed something that would not be fully understood for 2,000 years. God walked through the blood alone, because he knew that one day he would bleed alone. 2,000 years after Abraham fell asleep in that field, another man lay unconscious in a garden. His name was Jesus, the seed of Abraham, the fulfillment of the covenant. And he prayed, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." But it was not possible, because the covenant had already been cut. The curse had already been taken. The oath had already been sworn, and God does not break his word. So Jesus walked alone, through the betrayal, through the trial, through the scourging, through the nails. He walked the path between the pieces. And on a hill outside Jerusalem, the body of God in human flesh was torn apart, split, pierced, cut in two by a Roman spear. The covenant God made with Abraham in the darkness was a preview of the cross. God walked through the blood alone in Genesis 15 because he knew he would walk through it again on Golgotha. And just like Abraham, we are unconscious to the cost. We do not see it happening. We do not grasp the weight. We are asleep to the full horror of what it required. But when we wake up, the covenant is finished. The curse is paid. The promise is secured. And all we have to do is believe, not because belief is a work, but because belief is the moment we stop trying to walk through the blood ourselves and let God carry the weight. That is what Abraham learned when he woke up. The pieces were still there. The blood was still on the ground, but the covenant was done. He did not have to perform. He did not have to prove. He did not have to earn. God had already walked through, and the same grace that put Abraham to sleep is the grace that saves us now. Here is the detail most people miss. In Genesis 15, verse 18, after the ceremony is complete, the text says this: "On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram." The Hebrew word for made is karet. It means to cut. The Lord cut a covenant with Abram, not established, not formed, cut, because covenant requires cutting. It requires blood. It requires death. And God cut it alone. But there is another layer. The land God promises Abraham in that verse stretches from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. That is not just Canaan. That is the entire ancient Near East. That is the whole world Abraham knew. God is not just promising a plot of land. He is promising dominion. He is promising inheritance. He is promising that through Abraham's seed, the entire earth will be blessed. And who is that seed? Galatians 3 verse 16 tells us, "Now the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring." It does not say "and to offsprings," referring to many, but referring to one, "and to your offspring, who is Christ." The covenant God cut with Abraham was not just about Isaac. It was about Jesus. And the blessing God promised was not just land. It was salvation. The whole story, from Genesis 15 to Golgotha, is one unbroken line of blood and grace. God walked through the pieces in the darkness so that we could walk through the veil into his presence. God took the curse so we could receive the blessing. God bled alone so we would never have to. This is the God we serve, not a God who demands we meet him halfway, not a God who makes promises and then waits to see if we are worthy, not a God who says, "I will love you if you keep your end of the deal." This is a God who walks through blood alone, who takes the curse upon himself, who guarantees the promise even when we are unconscious, even when we fail, even when we are too weak to stand. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. But righteousness was not something Abraham produced. It was something God declared. It was not Abraham's strength. It was God's grace. And that same grace is still cutting covenants today. When Jesus died on the cross, he walked through the blood alone. We were not there. We did not help. We did not earn it. We were as unconscious to the cost as Abraham was in that dark field. But when we woke up, the covenant was already made. The promise was already secured. The curse was already paid. And all we have to do is believe. Not because belief is a work, but because belief is the moment we stop trying to save ourselves and let God carry the weight he already chose to bear. That is what happened in the darkness. That is what Abraham learned when he woke up. That is what we are still learning now. God does not ask you to be strong enough to keep his promises. He asks you to trust that he already has. You may be sitting in the same silence Abraham sat in, waiting for a promise that feels too big, too late, too impossible. Pieces of your life may not make sense yet. Some feel dead. Some feel torn apart by vultures you cannot fight. And you may wonder, where is God in this? He is walking through the blood, moving in darkness you cannot see, binding himself to a promise you did not earn, taking the curse you could never pay, and one day you will wake up and the covenant will be finished. If this story moved you, if it brought the Bible closer, stay, subscribe. I want to keep telling stories that make the ancient text feel written about your life. Leave a comment. Tell me what you are waiting for, because the God who met Abraham in the darkness is still making covenants today, and he still walks through the blood alone, so you do not have to.